Hello out there, thinkers, linkers, and mappers. We are really happy to host a series of conversations around the topic of tools for thinking. Our longer-term goal is to spark a diverse, connected, shared memory that will help us make important decisions together. Our near-term goal with these podcasts is to blow more oxygen on the growing tools for thinking sector, addressing key issues and talking with the people who are doing the work. This podcast is created by Betaworks, a New York City-based startup studio. I'm Jerry Mikulski, your interlocutor and obsessive mind mapper, and our topic today is funding tools for thinking. Our guests are Andrew Sutherland, founder of Quizlet, James Cham, partner at Bloomberg BETA, and John Borthwick, founder of Betaworks. And we've got a lovely set of issues in front of us. We've been exploring great things on the different podcast episodes, including some of what was coming up in our prep conversation here about, hey, are tools for thinking possible without changing the OS and the hardware? And we'll sort of get there. But I think a common interest here for us is, what is a path to market for tools for thinking? And these tools for thinking are sometimes quirky. I don't know that any of them looks like the next Facebook or the next LinkedIn or some major platform or a big unicorn. And yet, the need for these things appears to me to be pretty big. Like we sort of need to figure out how to think together better. We're kind of stuck in some early phase of what the visions for collaborative thought and collective sense making and all that might be. So let me just go James, Andrew, John for the same sort of question. What are some either role models for making it to market or possible paths that you see for this sector? What have you imagined as possible, or what stories do you play for yourself that are sort of cautionary tales for how this market ever emerges?
If you just look at what's happened so far, I think the most interesting example has been the adoption of Roam, the Roam note-taking tool. And it sort of the story sort of flies in the face of a lot of ideas about early adoption and like it started as this tool that was incredibly hard to use, it had no onboarding experience, no like explanations of how to use it, but it's really powerful, and all of its adoption basically came through evangelists and word of mouth who tweeted about it a lot, or just like sat their friends down and gave them 30-minute demos, which I've done to many of my friends. And so, they're not running ads. They're not like doing anything like that. And it's very hard to use. And it's even with the demos, like it takes weeks to figure out how to make it work for you. And yet, it achieved some pretty large scale and some, a lot of user love, and then a lot of people who didn't get it. And maybe Snapchat was similar in the early days. Like the interface was bewildering, but people were so compelled by the core value props that they were willing to go through it. And so I think that's at least one important example, because to shift people's usage of to a fundamentally new action, it might not need to be easy to use.
Which is interesting, yeah, because there's so much emphasis on ease of use everywhere, and so many things get stuck trying to hurdle that bump in a way. John, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that I agree with the way that Andrew framed that. And I think the analogy of Snapchat is really interesting, because Snapchat, I think used one of the first apps to use a truly native mobile swipe-based experience. And I think the Roam did something similar with a sort of graph, with the graph database, where it sort of exposed that, and you sort of fell into it and felt like, okay, here's an entire new world that I can start to construct something. I think that generally in these tools for thinking, we've sort of been trapped by both the success and also the limitations of the sort of the classic Word document, and that has meant that for a majority of people, they'll do their thinking in either a cloud-based Word document or some simple note-taking app. And they try these new things, and then they compare and contrast them to the simplicity of those forms. And getting people into a sort of radically new workflow and a new set of user behaviors is really challenging, right? It's just like it's a big ask, and you have to be able to both get people there and also show the payoffs or the benefits of it. And so, I'm a heavy Roam user, and I have. I still feel like after 3 years or so that the benefits, sort of the investment versus the benefits is still not in the right ratio. Like I wish there was like better search within there, because I'm constantly trying to discover stuff, right? I have Roam up right now. And I made some notes in advance of this podcast. And then I made the notes like 2 weeks ago, I had to find them. And just finding things is tricky.
James?
As you talk about this, I think of two sort of like, I guess, two concepts. One is this idea of legibility, and the other is this idea of status. I think one of the things that's interesting about these new tools for thought is how important the context is, and how important like the initial set of folks is not just the idea that Roam promises these things, but it's also the fact that like, sort of John Borthwick told me that Roam promises these things. And in some way, like sort of, for I think that ability of Roam, where Roam started, made a huge difference. And I think that that's another part of the angle. There's almost a way in which the discussion around, there's no accident that some of these things start in these tight communities of committed believers, right? And I think that that's the other part of, I think, what's interesting. And then of course, sort of I think about the promise of these tools for thought, and I do wonder, in some ways, there's a delicious vagueness in what the end product is or the end promise is, and in that way, there's a little bit of like sort of like the right analogies might be early religions rather than sort of how to copy the next SaaS application, because the changes that folks are proposing or hoping for are so much bigger and so much more exciting.
Yeah.
So interesting.
So the two of you are both, investors who want to see their companies go to a large consumer scale. Like the early story of Roam is sort of one thing, but if you sort of bridge to everyone using something like this, like what do you think needs to happen?
So I think that is the second part, which is that legibility part, where it has to look like something that people already understand, or the use case. There's that next phase after folks understand what are the boundaries of a new product, or let's say in the case of Roam, as folks understand the boundaries of it and what it's good for. And then there's almost a way in which that sort of set of values and bundles of features then become legible to the next slightly bigger audience. And I think like that's sort of probably the right way to think about it. In the same way that, early days of the browser, sort of they make, browsers make no sense to a normie, but then one day they're able to see their ESPN sports scores and they're very happy.
This has been a consistent theme through our podcast calls, and I'm referring to it sort of as the tractor beam of the desktop UI and the Office suite, that new and interesting pioneering products kind of get dragged back to look more familiar to people so that there'll be some uptake, because a lot of these exotic tools have a real hard problem getting people trained up. So we can sort of include that by reference in some of the other calls. But I'll point here also to, like, inspired by what you just said, James, Facebook's start, which notoriously was you had to have a harvard.edu email address, and then you had to have an Ivy League address, and then you had to have a college address, and then all human beings and their dogs could sort of join Facebook. But the path taken was one of, hey, I'd like to be in that group too, sort of early on. And then a story that came up in episode 3 was about HyperCard, which I think a lot of us are fans of. And the story was that Bill Atkinson invents HyperCard and says, here, like, ship this with the Mac. And Jean-Louis Gasset is so worried that people will pick up the Mac and just code their own stacks and not need software, that he tries to block HyperCard shipping with the Mac, because he's trying to stand up a software development community that's actually going to write a lot of software to make the Mac cooler and better and more interesting than the competing machines. And so HyperCard is almost doesn't make it out. Atkinson sort of has to blackmail Apple to say, hey, you don't ship this with the Mac, I'm going to make it available openly somehow. And this is before the internet, before open source software is so easily moved around. But there's this hard thing. And then a third thing I want to put in the mix is, and yet now and then new interfaces are born out of whole cloth, like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant, which are now so commonplace as to be ridiculous, right? I mean, anybody with any of these phones can call out at any moment, and there's a voice UI that's actually pretty good. And it's very different from, it is not restricted by the desktop metaphor or any of those things I just mentioned. And it's like, okay, so, and we're not using those voice assistants for thinking tools much that I know of, right?
Okay, so now you've gotten one of my hobby horses. Which
Excellent.
I think that like voice interfaces are both the future and totally squandered right now. It is a little shocking to me how trapped sort of the existing big players have been with ideas around how the architecture and the value of voice applications should fit. And I think that's partly because so many of the core teams that built terrific voice models came from a world where that was the actual value rather than the actual application. And so we're stuck in this world where voice really is meant to be thrown and tossed over as like little instructions that kind of work, but don't offer an incredible amount of value. And I think that's exactly where startups end up being successful. And that is certainly one of the places where I continue to search and dream.
Yeah, so I agree. And I mean, I think that, James, you're making a compelling argument that we need, or at least pushing towards that we need new interfaces or new, potentially new hardware, new devices to be able to like think, to get these tools for thinking really working. I think that, I break it up. I break thinking up into several things, but a few of them is a lot of what thinking is for people in this context is a personal memory base, or just like a place to like store things to be able to recall them. And so I think that that's one part of thinking. And I think that actually is very subject to, Jerry, your tractor beam, because that sort of is it's a workflow and a structure that people are like, okay, I store my data and then I just want to be able to find it again. I want to make sure it's discoverable, right? A second kind of thinking is what we're actually doing right now, which is conversations. And so we're having a conversation together. And I think that is a much harder place to actually track that thinking. Maybe voice interfaces can do something there, right? I mean, I played around with a lot of these tools that will do a voice transcription. What I really want is a voice transcription, but with surfacing the concepts that we're talking about and helping me remember and both think socially in this context, right? So that's the second kind of thinking. A third kind of thinking, this past weekend, I was dipping back into Hannah Arendt and some of her work. And, she talks a lot about
that's depressing.
Sort of, no, it's not all depressing. But she talks a lot about that second voice in your head and being able to have a conversation with yourself and the importance of being able to do that. And that to me is, central to thinking. And I do wonder whether large language models and some of the stuff that's starting to come out of the sort of generative space can help with that sort of conversation in our heads, and give us a place where we can have that conversation in our heads on a computing surface. And I'm not sure what surface that is, if it's a voice surface or if it's a messaging-based UI or what it is, but I just wonder if there's something there that can sort of help with that third kind of thinking. So those are at least three kinds of thinking that I think are worth unpacking a bit and exploring.
That's fascinating. I have to admit, this hits on a couple of things that I've been doing. I've been going to a few conferences recently, and mostly because I'm too socially awkward to come up with small talk. The thing I've been doing is I've been trying to get people to sign up for OpenAI and use the playground. And I'm sort of surprised, and use GPT-3 directly, right? And I've been sort of surprised how few people have actually done it. And also how delightful it is once you get people to go through all the little steps to like provide their email and their phone number and actually get them into the playground rather than some other tool, some mediating tool or some application. When you actually get them to use it and they start playing with it, it is sort of stunning to me, the sorts of conversations or the sort of things people are able to start doing. And, one of the things I've been doing, John, which is along your lines, is I've been having imaginary conversations where I will literally write a one-act play between Martin Luther and Richard Nixon about politics. And they'll like just do a little, and then it'll generate like this short, sort of like 5 to 50 line play in which they have these conversations. Or I will do, sort of like explain, sort of like, I think the best one was the conversation between Marx and Santa Claus, right? And it's just interesting because in those conversations, you see how good GPT-3 is at simulating, plays, but also having ideas converge, right? And that, I think, is a key part of tools for thought.
Yeah, you're also having fun, right? And I think that the fact that you're doing that for fun and you're enjoying it, when we talk about like establishing new behaviors and breaking through the existing patterns and workflows, it's like fun. Giving somebody something to do that's fun is like a surefire way to like, going back to where Andrew was before, Snapchat was just fun, right? You could say it was a swipe first UI and all this other stuff, but it was just kind of like, it felt like it was just a fun space.
And when you use it directly, you end up in a very different place than the theoretical thing, right? A lot of my work has been around machine learning and artificial intelligence. And there's all this great theoretical thought around how dangerous it could be. But when you actually play with an incredibly powerful model, it's kind of like getting a hammer for the first time. You realize what it's good at, and you also realize you shouldn't stub your toe, right? Like you use the hammer and you bang your toe, it really hurts, right? And so like that kind of feedback mechanism and understanding of what these things are good at and bad at, I think is the sort of intuition that's available to us right now.
Andrew, you look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing on my mind with these language models is with Quizlet, we spent a while thinking about, AI tutoring and having models that could, pose a question to you and then sort of help you work through it in a way that, understood what you were thinking and stuff like that. And I think there's a lot of value that can be created in building something like that. The thing that gives me pause on both like voice UIs and stuff like that is when you have a great teacher that you have a relationship with that you care about, that is part of that's sort of a major motivation to respond or to try. If I was having this conversation with the three of you and you are all GPT-3 bots, I might not be applying myself in the same way as like the complex dynamics of the three of us and the fact that I respect all of you and, might do a deal with you in the future and like all these other things. And so, it just sort of, I don't know what the answer is, but it makes me wonder how far we'll go on language model UIs when they're not embodied.
So, Andrew, this might trivialize your question a little bit, but the movie Her, Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with an AI which is fully embodied and very much sounds like a person, and that seems very feasible. So could there be a quick sort of workaround where it's like, hey, you're talking to Socrates right now, and you get to ask him anything you want?
It's not good enough yet, but just wait. It'll like once it seduces me, then I'll be I'll be fine.
Or not. I mean, the movie doesn't turn out all that well.
Yeah.
But there's all sorts of interesting possibilities there, and this idea of having a relationship with a great teacher is really important here, because all these language models can assume different kinds of roles in our lives. One of them could just be the diligent note taker during our call, as John was saying a little earlier, like, hey, if any of us mentioned a book, a site, a paper, an experiment, it could show up and say, do you mean this one? And put the link in the chat. And that would be perfectly fine use for an AI that would make our lives a little bit easier. But it's not the thing we're talking about here, which is more challenging, more interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think it would be more fun to have like your little AI children, or like things that you have trained from scratch and taught what you care about. And like you're talking about this sort of second voice in your head. Like if you have a bunch of these little bots and they're like things that have come up not knowing anything, but you've sort of trained them in your thinking, and then you could have conversations with them, like then your relationship to them is not so, it's like you feel a sense of pride or ownership of when they think. And I think that could be a path forward.
And then I think there's also a dynamic, though, of how these ideas, when in the abstract, sound either foreign or crazy, like the idea of AI children in the abstract seems crazy, but then the reality is that we feel a great deal of ownership over a lot of things that we create, right? And I think there's almost a way in which the challenge for great entrepreneurs or product people is to make those sort of abstract ideas concrete in some way that, like, you know, sort of a normal person or even like an early adopter might be able to sort of like get a glimpse of that and start to feel that little bit of emotional tie, or that first step, right? And I think that that's
Right.
part of what's exciting about right now.
Yeah, I think that the embodiment question is a really interesting question. And you can sort of see the relationship. I mean, I think that the names that companies have chosen for these sort of AI children, I remember right at the beginning of Hugging Face, right? The first iteration of Hugging Face, they had it as a pet, right? It was meant to be like an AI pet, and Clem, the founder, was like, his belief was that everybody is going to have, just like we have pets that we acknowledge, that we love, that we care for, that we acknowledge have some degree of intelligence that can help us as humans. We're going to have AI pets in the same way. And so AI friends, AI pets, I think that the names of these things, like Siri is such a love name, right? It's just like, because it's almost as a human embodiment, but I've never met anybody called Siri. I've certainly met people called Alexa. So yes, I think it is, and I am not sure. I mean, Andrew, I don't think that these large language models, I don't think that they're on a path to becoming sentient or to becoming like full thinking partners. I mean, I think that the sort of limitations of the structural limitations of the models we're going to run into at some point.
Just wait till GPT-4.
4 or 5, I just think that, aren't they just like ever increasing, like, they're still not thinking. They're talking back at you, and their ability to be able to discern patterns in language is extraordinary. But I think it's different from thinking, and so yeah.
Okay,
I don't
so
know. It's the embodiment. Yeah.
I don't want to get too metaphysical on a Monday morning, although you're already at noon on the East Coast. But I would propose that actually we already have superhuman intelligences that we sort of like live with and live around all day long. And these sorts of things are like organizations or nation states or corporations. And in some ways, and then look, I'm traditionally religious, right? But in some ways, for me, it's not that hard to ascribe intelligence to, you know, like there's Elon Musk trying to run Twitter right now. And then there's this weird thing, this amalgamation of people and rules and processes and software called Twitter that he can't even control it because in some ways it's actually alive.
Sort of the hive mind or the collective intelligence or whatever you want to call it in lots of different ways.
I mean, I think the social, I can't believe we got to Musk and Twitter. There's now many forks, but I think that social software has a life in of itself and has a, there's, and takes on, takes a shape of itself. But I think that I still view that as being separate and distinct from a thinking being. But let's maybe pause this rabbit hole because before we get to parrots. So going back to where we were a few minutes ago, I think that the need for new interfaces, I think, is critical here. The term embodiment, I was struck when, James, you were talking before, when you got really passionate, suddenly your hands start like moving around. I do the same thing, right? And I just think that we need to be able to like have interfaces that can actually, where we can, the embodiment of our thinking is reflected in those interfaces. And I don't know exactly what that looks like yet. Is it a mixed reality interface? Is it some sort of sensor kind of data tracking interface? But I think that there's a whole interface issue here, which is not the freaking keyboard, right? And a mouse. It's like, and voice may be part of it, but I think it's we need to get our bodies involved in thinking.
In some cases, I mean, it's like, are you stepping into data sets or whatever else? And there's some work on augmented reality where you actually can walk through a data set and see patterns and so forth. And if the data has dimensionality, it makes a lot of sense. I think in a lot of other cases, we're watching Zuckerberg say, hey, everybody, come into my metaverse. And I and a bunch of other people I know are just sort of furrowing our brow going, I don't see anything interesting in your metaverse that was not already there in Second Life many years ago that we're not all addicted to and using heavily. And there's like plenty of interesting reasons why. So this space of voice interfaces, 3D interfaces, AR, VR, XR, whatever else are, and tools for thinking is just young. We need some more play, some more experimentation. I'm also interested back in the conversation about what are the paths to market or paths, and path to market, it for me is maybe a limiting way of framing the question. It's paths to broad use and applicability of these tools for thinking. And a piece of that seems to me to be this difference between the commons and proprietary tools or data sets. And how do we motivate more tools to write toward each other, and how do we motivate more people to share their notes? Because one way this plays out is that everybody as individuals just has a better note assistant and a better personal assistant, and they get smarter, like Iron Man or whatever. They try to become little individual Tony Starks. The other way this plays out is that we build a better collective intelligence. And this then is an emergent phenomenon between us that is hard to control, like social media, but I think really promising in terms of the complexity of the problems we're all facing. James?
I will admit, I think partly along those terms, and partly in terms of economic legibility. I think there's a way in which once people are able to grasp onto something, there's both like is it useful to me, but there's another part of it which is like, do I know how much it costs? Do you know what it means? Can other people play with me on this? And I think that economic legibility is part of what we're seeing with large language models right now, right? Where like, it's not that the tools suddenly started working. There have been great demos for 2 years at GPT-3, right? But what changes, like for the first time, a couple different players for different reasons, have made it economically legible. So now either I can download this model and suddenly use it myself and cause all sorts of mischief, or I know how much it's going to cost. And because of that creates all these interesting opportunities. I think in that way, the right metaphor might be, sort of thinking about adoption of Unix versus adoption of Linux, right? And then you think about sort of all the things that you're able to build when it's, sort of owned by, when there's a big fight between Digital and AT&T and all those guys, and you're not able to get anything done at a mass level. And then when Linux comes around, like because one crazy guy decides to go through all the trouble to make this operating system and make it free, like it's like, I mean, it's one guy convincing a bunch of people, right? But like that one thing, something unlocks all this opportunity, you know, and all these different web services. So that's partly that's my own mental model as I'm watching all these very big players spending incredible amounts of money trying to figure out how to like build these models.
And Linus Torvalds' project is not a for-profit startup. It's just a, hey, everybody, I want to make this Unix thing run on my laptop. And the plausible promise, as Clay Shirky sort of phrased it so long ago, I think really nicely, was whoever works on this, this is going to be under GPL, and any effort you put in here will be of benefit to everybody. And that turned out to be a great way to recruit a tremendous number of participants, and we're seeing the effects of that.
And then critically, though, this was not just an idealistic thing. A bunch of people made a bunch of money holding a bunch of things very private into themselves, right? That sort of, this was one layer that became commodified and thus became economically legible, and then people did a bunch of stuff on top of that.
Precisely. And I was lucky enough to interview Bob LeBlanc back in the day. He was an IBM exec who told me the story of how they adopted stuff. And a friend of mine is John Patrick, who was one of the mavericks inside of IBM, who convinced them to go look at Apache, then Linux, and then other sorts of things, saving the company, because I was a tech industry trends analyst at the time, and IBM was about to go under. Sun and Apollo were eating their lunch, and IBM had no answers. And IBM's own internal architects had spent 10 years trying to make their 5 platforms talk to each other with no success. And along comes TCP/IP, Apache, Linux, and all these things, right? So that's a really nice model, because shortly IBM was selling $2 billion in service revenues on top of open source software. And so now what are the analogs in this space with large learning models to get us there?
So before I was giving a list, I gave a list of 3 different ways of thinking. There's a 4th one, which I'll add to that list, which is developing frameworks, right? And we're doing that right now, right? And so I think that once you start to develop these frameworks around open source closed, around economic legibility, around legibility of stacks, of things, you start to you help people think, and you help yourself think. And you also sort of create these information stacks, which I think can both serve you and also can atrophy thinking. I think that this opens the amount of, or the unlock that's been achieved with these large language models, and particularly the visual models with stability, and being able to access and download and find models on Hugging Face and being able to actually run them yourself, I think is, we've seen in the last 2 months, 1.5 million people messing around with stability. And it's truly extraordinary. And I think what it does is that it sort of, it makes, there's something really fun about it. There's something really creative about it. I think it's opening the new door to our sort of imagination and how we can think with these tools. And it feels to me very much like the sort of the beginning of a new interface, right? Just like the browser felt like something new and the phone felt like something new, this feels like something new. And then I also think there's something so incredibly empowering about it, because these models have been used essentially on us for the last 5-10 years, right? Probably the most sophisticated AI that we talk to every day is TikTok, right? And now suddenly we can talk to, or we can have some control and some agency and talk to it and construct with it. So I think that that's incredibly powerful and also fun.
Okay, Andrew, you spent a bunch of time with a bunch of very smart thinkers recently. Like, you hear all of this, like, what do you think?
Yeah, so I recently ran a conference in France, in the countryside, for 6 days, and sort of got a bunch of people together who are thinking about this stuff, and sort of independent researchers thinking about future of computer interfaces. And there are a bunch of different interests, but I think large language models, obviously a big one, and another is just like spatial interfaces, or embodied computing, tangible computing. And yeah, what struck me from that is like how much for a long time we've been excited about spatial interfaces or being able to interact with computers in 3D space, which is how our minds work. And yet, like, there isn't really, much happening there. I guess with the exception of sort of Facebook and Meta XR stuff, like no one is really building tools for thought stuff that allows you to access your 3D faculties of your brain. And Dynamic Land is maybe the best example. We had a couple of people who were used to work on Dynamic Land there, and that project is kind of dormant. And so I think that may be another space where like it's sort of pre-Rome mode, where like everyone sort of thinks that there's a bunch of important stuff that could happen with like embodied computing or physical computers, but there's no killer demo yet. There's nothing that like you can see and you like, we need one of these in every office or every home. But I think it'll get there.
When you talk about Dynamic Land, which of course was something that I think both of us were obsessed with, the interesting question to me is why it seems so obvious as the right solution, and why hasn't it worked yet is sort of one of those delicious questions. And one answer might be that it's just not the adjacent possible yet. There's a way in which Rome only makes sense because we had years and years of outliners, right? I was an investor in a company called Workflowy, or I'm still an investor in a company called Workflowy, and then sort of Rome builds some innovation on top of that, right? And I think that there's that question around, I thought that with the pandemic, maybe people would buy lots of projectors and then have projectors in the room. I actually bought a couple projectors to stick in my room. And I thought that would lend itself towards, something like Dynamic Land, or the fact that we have way too many cameras. Like I have 3 phones on my desk alone, right? And the fact that was all true might lend itself to that, but it hasn't quite coalesced yet. And I do wonder, what's the step before Dynamic Land?
And for people not familiar with Dynamic Land, that was the environment where there's basically ceiling-mounted cameras that can see where everybody is, and then there's physical objects that you can use and place on tables and so forth that are meaningful to the system, and you compose things you want to do or whatever in the environment. Is that right? And Brett Victor and a bunch of others were kind of involved in this.
That's right. Well, it has both cameras and projectors, so
right.
You can sort of all be standing around a table, and it can see what's sort of on the table. You can adjust the things on the table. You can add new code to the table, and it sort of instantly recognizes and then changes what's being projected onto the table.
It's like dance floors with Voronoi diagrams, except more useful.
But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is incredibly compelling about that is that it's the best demo of like a shared computing environment that I've seen, where like all of us, the 4 of us right now, are on personal computers. There's no way for me to meaningfully use your computer at the same time that you're using your computer. And like, humans are very social creatures. Humans like think collaboratively. Humans like want to work in a shared environment, but like, obviously like me having a mouse and you having a mouse on the same computer is like not the answer. And so like we've just done like not enough thinking and not enough building on like multiple people being able to compute together.
Andrew, what else came out of the event you hosted in France? What other sorts of things showed up in the conversation?
I mean, lots of really cool language model demos, people building, just sort of like interfaces on top of language models. Like the tricky thing, or the sort of problem for a long time has been like, well, yeah, you can have a prompt which you type into and it responds, or you can have some sort of conversational thing. But a conversational UI is super limiting and doesn't expose all the power of a language model. And so there were several people that were showing sort of user interfaces or like graphical things that had underlying them or games that had underlying them language models, but you could like play a lot more because they were powered by models underneath.
It's very interesting because we tend to limit the UI to like, oh, this is a speech interface, so we're just going to speak to this thing. And then you're in the realm of, well, how much can you communicate only through speech? And we're doing very little sort of combined arms warfare on thinking together, where we have sensor fusion, data fusion, AI fusion of different kinds that lets you move to the kind of interaction that is best suited to the thing you're trying to do right now.
Yeah, I think that's having the ability to be able to fluidly move into these spaces, because right now it requires, if all of us said we wanted to use a shared whiteboard in Zoom, right? When you were talking before, James, I was thinking, damn, that button is now on my Chrome in Zoom, and I've just never used it. Right. And so if all of us wanted to do that, there would be so much startup cost and switching costs. So we'd forget what we were thinking about or why we wanted to use it. Right. And so much of the time, I think that the software actually hinders the process of thinking or the process of doing the work that you want to do, and that you end up just like you try it once or twice because it's fun to do new things, but then you realize actually it's not actually helping us think. Going back to Dynamic Land, I think it's totally fascinating because we have in the accelerator program, there's one company that had a physical piece of hardware similar to Dynamic Land, and then they ended up making that into a software-based campus that incorporates large language models that's come out, and I think that a lot of their thinking was informed by a physical testing environment that they created, similar to Dynamic Land. So it's like, where does the UI for this stuff live, right? Is it an assistive conversational bot that like sits on the side and that, is your AI child or your AI pet? Is it in the space? Does it have memory that moves across spaces? Does it, how much control do I have on it? Does it sit at the does it sit at the operating system level, and does Siri grow up into this, or where does it live, or is it a separate piece of hardware, right? Because you speak to some of the people who built hardware in this space, and they're just like, the only way to actually create a new experience is to introduce a new piece of hardware.
I mean, I think a real conundrum at the heart of this tools for thinking stuff is like, computers are so powerful, but also so distracting. Like, you sit down at your computer to do one thing, you end up doing like 10 other things and not the thing you originally intended. And everyone does that. And so part of what if we want good tools for thinking, we actually need to turn down the volume on our computers, make them like quieter, make them like more subtle, make them, maybe not have a screen that's always there. And so like maybe, like there's a projector, it like, appears when you need to have some interaction, but then it like goes away, or when you walk into your office, like you don't see any computer, and it doesn't like prompt you to like sit down and work on it. But when you need it, you can activate it. And I think that there's a tension with like that sort of, let's turn down the volume angle with like I love computers. Computers are really powerful. I want them to be more powerful. And I want to be sort of immersed more. So those two are things that are hard to hold in tension, because I want, like, I do my best thinking often, writing on a piece of paper, or going on a walk, or in the shower, or I mean, I've got paper notes right here. You've got paper notes. You just showed them. Like, So like clearly computers of today are like not helping us think, and getting like pulling away from them, using paper, using like a whiteboard, using like a walk with a friend, like those are often much more conducive to thinking than whatever the digital equivalent is.
So we're sort of stumped by the simple question of how do we improve thinking, right? John, you started with what is thinking, and we're pointing to a variety of experiments around improving thinking, improving interfaces, riffing on these sorts of things. But it's funny because, in 1968, Doug Engelbart does the mother of all demos, and boy, that fuels 30, 40 years worth of innovation and design that we're a little bit prisoners of right now. When we talk about the tractor beam and the desktop metaphor, that's that string of innovation, which ate the world in some sense. And it ate our brains also, to the point where it's hard to imagine other things. I know that before the iPhone is introduced in 2007, I had not envisioned a little slab of unobtainium with no real buttons on it, just like a couple little soft buttons kind of, that could turn itself into just about everything. I hadn't pictured that, it hadn't occurred to me, and now it's hard to unsee that. I can't imagine the world without, the touchscreen slab that is connected to everything. And so somewhere on the tables and in the rooms and in the conversations we've been having, somewhere in those already is the thing that we're going to take for granted in 50 years. Because historically, when each of these little revolutions happens, the thing was around and somebody was shouting from the sidelines, not being heard because their demo was too early, underpowered, whatever, right? And so it's in the mix right now, the thing that we're going to all assume, well, why could nobody see that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that it also sort of that point gives me a sense of urgency on like investing and working on this, because the sort of early people who shape a lot of these things have enormous impact, and the designers of the iPhone sort of set the rules. They made a bunch of probably arbitrary decisions in the very early on that we're all sort of living with, that were very consequential. And I think we're sort of in the early parts of a phase transition where like we'll probably not be looking at a desktop metaphor 10, 15 years from now. But so the values of the system, the privacy of a system, the like how it shapes your thinking, those are totally up to be defined. And who defines them and what reasons they use to define them will be, shaped in some room somewhere in the world. We don't know where. In the next like 3 years maybe.
And I'll put in a small plug here for the podcast that's going to drop this Friday. So by the time this episode airs, it will be available. And it's basically episode 7, Rethinking Data Structures, with Paul Roney and Alex Obenauer. And we had this, we went really deep into some of these sorts of things, including the history of the metaphors and all that. And one of the things that Paul was saying strongly was, hey, we actually sort of kept drifting away from the usefulness of the metaphor. We kept breaking the metaphors, which are in fact in many cases really useful. And he was pointing out that the latest rev of Mac OS, which is Ventura, further weakens sort of the finder's adherence to the good old metaphor, which in some cases made it more useful. And then we started talking about how do tools for thinking have to be embedded in the OS? Right? And does this mean some fundamental changes to the way we think about data, shared ideas? It's really quite fascinating. Underkoffler, by the way, is the guy who developed the G-Speak interface that Tom Cruise uses in Minority Report when he's busy looking for pre-crime. So that's not a flashy UI bit of CGI. That's actually a working operating system that he can demo that allows different people to throw things up on screen and drag them onto their machines. It's very much a collaborative space for thinking. So that's kind of on the table as well. It's one of the piece parts. Go ahead, John.
Literally on the table, right?
Yeah, Exactly.
on the metaphorical table. So I think that going back to look, if we assume let's just play this game out, right? So let's assume that the patterns or these new like seedlings of things are already there, right? And so let's try and sort of like discern where we think they are, right? So I think the one is clearly in spatial. Right. I mean, I think that what Meta is doing and what the Quest Pro, Quest Pro has is clearly a piece of it, but I think it is much more profound than that. Right. I remember when I first went down to Magic Leap and did a demo of that. It was like one of those moments that sort of like changed the way I thought about computer interfaces. I think spatial is one. I think auditory is one. Right. I do think that there's like, I walk around the streets here in Manhattan and, 10, 20% of the people have their AirPods in. They're not actually in this world right now. They are partially in another world, right? They're on a conversation with their friends. They're on a podcast, but they are like their consciousness and their thinking is happening in multi-dimensions. Sure, they're crossing the street, but they're also like living somewhere else. And I think that audio is such an important part of this. And that is like, if the Quest is like a visual interface, this is like an amazing audio interface that's already pretty out there. So I think those are two. I think large language models and AI interfaces is another one. What are other ones that we see right now? And I just sort of did the cheap shot of summarizing a lot of stuff we already talked about. So let's push to the next edge of it.
Now I have trouble with the spatial thing. So my take on this, I sort of borrow. Remember the ViewMaster, the little thing that you put a little carousel of pictures into, and you go click. I haven't found a better metaphor for this. But how do I click and switch into the next appropriate interface for the thing I'm trying to do now? So I just wandered into talking about COVID patterns and or looking at Hans Rosling's data about progress, in mortality or whatever. I could really use augmented reality stepping into data and manipulating it now with a physical interface. The spatial makes a lot of sense there. But now I step back into this conversation and thinking about what references are we making and what happened before. Kind of want to be back in 2D land, and I want some productive way to share 2D insights with you all in a way that matches the tools that you're note-taking with in some other sense. So I'm trying to figure out, yeah.
I think what you're saying there is that there is some other thing that captures maybe the fluidity between these spaces.
Yes. That these spaces can coexist in an arena that we get used to, which allows us to elegantly shift between the right tool for the right task, as opposed to being dedicated to learning one interface and trying to make everything fit one of these metaphors.
Jam everything
because they
in,
don't.
Right.
Years ago, I was at David Eisenberg's Freedom to Connect conference, and there was a demo that was going to happen showing 3D avatars, collaborating, and I had to go take a call, so I put into the chat, I said, hey, watch, it's going to take 10 minutes to set this up and for the avatar to walk over to the whiteboard and get properly connected to the whiteboard to try to start doing this demo. And sure as hell, that's exactly what happened. It was really awkward, really clumsy, no better than Google Docs, which we now take for granted, right? And so how do we begin to map tasks and design and intentions to the tools that we're talking about? That gets really interesting. And then if you then fold machine learning into the equation, there's a dozen different ways that machine learning could be useful, and we're not thinking very fruitfully about what are those different kinds of roles and how can we actually make these things our helpers, our assistants in different ways, and sometimes our thinking partners in different ways.
As you talk about this, Jerry, my head goes in two places. One is, I do think everyone should be playing with these models right now, because I think you'll be surprised at what it's good and bad at. Yep. But it's possible that it's only about reducing friction. It's possible that the language models will not do anything sexy, that they will just make it easier for you to configure things, right? Now, that would be a miracle, right? It'd be a miracle if it actually was, sort of made that part easier. And if it did that, then it might add a lot of value to the universe. If it literally got rid of the 10 minutes of setup, right? Because it was flexible enough to understand and catch dynamics and figure out lighting, whatever, all those sorts of things. So that's one possibility. But the other thing is, John was talking about sort of these different modes of interaction, it did strike me that one thing that we do assume is that we do assume that these things are bottom up, that we do assume that these things are adopted by individuals, right? And that individuals buy these things and then create value. And then because they create more value, the organization sort of adopts it. I'm pretty sure that's how it's going to work. But it's worth imagining what happens if, like, let's say that real estate is decimated the next 5 years, and then people who own a lot of real estate have to innovate in dramatic ways, right? It's possible that in those cases, tools for thought come top down, right? That they end up becoming features of real estate in the same way that we expect to have air conditioning. It's possible that we'll expect to have, I don't know, name your sort of like collaboration environment. And that's the only reason you're willing to go into someone's office or willing to do something like that, because they're decked out to do these things. Right. I don't think that's going to happen, but it's possible, right? And I think the interesting thing, at least to me, is to like twist around the way we think about tools for thought around like what are other ways that this might be attacked from an economic point of view.
So there's a piece of this that writing tools, the writing AIs, I think are already good at, which is when you're busy thinking about writing an essay, a document of any kind, sometimes you get into a rut and there's only one path you see through. And these models are really good at, hey, give me 6 different ways of saying this thing I'm trying to say. And all of a sudden in front of you are 6 different paths into the topic. And some of them will be things you didn't even think about as a framing or way of explaining the thing you're trying to do. That is doable today and could be transformative for writers.
I don't know if you guys have done this. Like, I will literally, like, I'll have a very thoughtful conversation with someone. At the end of it, I'll be like, oh, I'll write a thank you note to them or something. And then I'll ask GPT-3 to generate a thank you note. And it oftentimes will do a better job than I will. Or the things that I thought were so original turn out to be just the average of everything else on the web, right?
That's
it's
amazing.
Kind of super depressing how like boring I turn out to be. But yes, I think that those are the sorts of opportunities available.
And then just the example I point to a lot when thinking about computer creativity is when AlphaGo basically beat Lee Sedol in the game of Go, then Google went and created AlphaZero, which was not trained on historic Go games, but rather trained just on the rules of Go. And then there's a really lovely chart where you can see how AlphaZero quickly beats Lee Sedol, then it beats AlphaGo, then it goes up into no man's land. And that little margin of new moves that nobody had conceived of in Go scholars are now studying because that was creativity, because AlphaZero had no preconceptions of 4,000 years of playing Go or however many years that the game has been around. And so it could go where no man has gone before, ironically. So I think there's a lot of narrow opportunities for exactly that kind of creativity and innovation, because general purpose AGI ain't happening real soon. I'm convinced of that. But I think extraordinary help in narrow domains is here now. And we have to figure out how to fold it back into this suite of tools for thinking in a productive way. And that's going to take a heck of a lot of cooperation across vertically focused, often siloed startups and projects and initiatives, I think, right? Because it's the combinations that are fruitful. It's the linkages and the leverage that the different tools give us together that are fruitful. And that space is hard to figure out.
So I'm watching. We've got a chat channel going, and I'm watching that. So James is asking a couple of questions here. So what are we missing in the conversation? So one thing I think we haven't talked about is the social side of thinking, and I think Twitter has been an incredibly important part of sort of public thinking.
Yeah,
and I think Twitter threads were like one of the great product breakthroughs that company executed on successfully, or pretty successfully. And I think that one of the things that, going back to where we started with Rome, one of the things that, sort of keyed me into the Rome world was, so just like I try to compose a tweet as a discrete thought, now I'm using blocks as discrete thoughts. And I can connect them as discrete blocks, and then I link them up into a page. So there were these basic sort of stacking metaphors that sort of became available. But let's talk a bit about the social side of this, because I do think that Twitter has like been, such an important part of this. I don't know if that will continue to be the case, or like how that will evolve, but I think that it is to date has been sort of a place where you could basically think in public.
And we should note for posterity's sake that this is the week after Elon Musk took control of Twitter. So we're at this very strange cusp in Twitter's history. It's a lot. Yeah, there's been a lot of interesting conversation about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to think about Twitter as like, a bunch of people at this conference that I just ran had only known each other through Twitter, as sort of were excited to meet each other for the first time because they like respected their thinking that they sort of showed on Twitter. And I think, a number of my friend Ed Cook, like I met because he tweeted that he was at a bar and I wanted to go meet him. And that was like 10 years ago. And now we're, best friends. And so, yeah, Twitter is maybe underrated in this sort of tools for thinking world where, or like, Ed would say he's an enthusiast of parties. And like, he's like, parties are basically the greatest invention or technology of humankind, where like per unit time, more ideas are shared, more romances started, more like new thoughts created, more friendships created in a party than like any other human activity we can think of. And so he, for example, has been working on and showed at the conference a demo of like, online party technology, and that has a ways to go, I think. But I think it's a really interesting point that that the social dimension of online stuff is one of the great accelerators of thinking.
Yeah, I think also it's just, I think making this stuff fun, right, is like so much
Playful.
of this, I think, it exists in my head in the sort of there's like, it's sort of like this stuff needs to be work and it needs to be hard, and it shouldn't have to be hard, right? It should be fluid. It should be like, it should be fun. And I think we have made too many of these tools to be like task driven. And then, going back to those models, productivity orientated, and going back to those models before is that I think that the idea and assumption that thinking is about acquiring information and controlling information. I think that thinking is about being able to have that conversation in your head about a particular thing, and then hopefully having it with another human being on a walk, at a party, do something. And that to me is the active part of the active process of thinking. It's not about being able to be really smart and saying, I knew exactly what happened on January 4th, 1976, right? It's like a fucking computer can do that way better than me. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, how can we make that active? Right. James also asked like really interesting things we'd seen in the accelerator program, because we are in the midst of this accelerator program. And I think that the large language model stuff I'm really passionate about. I totally think that, like James was saying earlier, and everybody else was keen off, this stuff is fun. It's fascinating. And we've seen a bunch of startups like starting to like expose different ways to be able to connect with these models. Is it in a spatial workspace where you basically can have ideas that you can then bounce off the models, and the models are sort of fine-tuned to specific areas like in Format? Is it in a gems-like space where you basically have all of your ideas and then the models are being used to connect your existing ideas? What is the way that these models actually sort of like, how do they function in the space? And how do, going back to that first question of like, how do we get to large scale adoption of a new workflow and a new tool for thinking? I think that is at the core of, what we're trying to do with this accelerator program. And Andrew, like you, I mean, I believe that we're at this really sort of exciting, precious time where all this stuff is starting to bubble up. And it's one of those times that, I've had the good fortune to live through a few of them, but it's like we have the opportunity, and I think some responsibility to actually see if we can make these damn machines think better with us. Because just because we made all the information in the world accessible, it doesn't mean we've made ourselves better at thinking about it.
Absolutely. Just scrolling back in what you said just a little bit, in education, kids education, there's a little phrase that I really like called hard fun, that kids don't want to be spoon-fed. They actually like hard fun. They like difficult, thorny things. They like to feel like they've mastered something. And then we don't apply that really to grown-ups. We don't apply that to adults. But I think what we're talking about here is that chewing on the issues in the world is hard fun, and that we adults are drawn to hard fun as long as there's a payoff. Because just chewing on something hard that has no payoff is not interesting. But wow, if you can kind of start to see that something might dissolve or improve because of your efforts and your efforts together, that's huge. I think that's gigantic. And I think that's a big motivator for a lot of us doing this work and for people coming into this field. And it hasn't translated into like, what's the onboarding process for some of these tools or techniques? It's like the onboarding thing is just like 4 fields away in the, hey, here's some arcane software, here's how to start using it. And it's not, here's a fun, thorny problem where we've gotten somewhere on, jump into the conversation with your tool.
Yeah, I think it's totally fascinating, right? We were talking about new interfaces and what are the seedlings. We keep coming back to this metaphor of the conversation, right? Just like, and being able to just have these very lightweight. So going back to your sort of question or the question before, what are the inclination coming off this call? I think these conversational interfaces, something like that could be the place this new thing sort of starts to emerge.
And I think along with conversations comes flexibility and variation. I think about, sort of like a few months ago, my daughter found Quizlet for the first time, and she's like, "Papa, I found a secret. I'm able to make these flashcards, about sort of studying with flashcards." And I think, it is interesting to look at something like that, which felt like for her so revelatory, right? And she's like, "This is the most amazing thing possible. I can do this anywhere now." Right. And then I compare and I think, what would that revelation feel like with a conversational interface? I don't really know. But I do think it's interesting to think about a lot of these, we know all the itches, right? All the desires of humanity kind of remain static. Right? We're not that different. But how it gets solved, or the opportunity, or what becomes easy, what's frictionless, what's even more capable, that's sort of the exciting thing that's happening right now. But that's my excuse for Andrew to say something about both Quizlet and about that as a tool for thought and opportunity.
That was actually that was a prompt, right?
Yeah, love that.
Yeah, I mean, Quizlet. I'm glad to hear that magic moment. I mean, that's been the reason for Quizlet's success is people sort of realize that they can help themselves learn, and we give them the tools, and they can run with them as far as they want. That's a really exciting, empowering feeling for a lot of people. Part of the reason I got into this sort of adjacent world, tools for thinking being adjacent to education, is after I left Quizlet, I was thinking about what I wanted to work on next, and I was doing all this research, doing all this reading, and trying to write about it, trying to sort of map it out. And I also found myself very, very frustrated with the tools themselves, the ways of how I use my own computer and how distracting it is and how interrupt driven it is. And so that's sort of the big part of the motivation for me is just how do we reclaim our own minds and be able to think for ourselves and not be so sort of plugged in or so like oriented towards solving other people's problems, or like just being in the sort of Borg of other people's things, and just be able to like think for ourselves, because it like sort of shocked me with how hard it was for myself even to do that after when I had the time and space to do it.
Yeah, thank you. Any other concluding thoughts? Because that was a really nice place to sort of sit and tantalize and imagine. If there are not, then let me take us out. Thanks everybody for listening to Tools for Thinking, a new podcast that might just help you with your thinking. If you're part of a startup in the sector, please knock on our door at betaworks.com, and thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it.